So this is my personal opinion, but I think I hold to it fairly strongly, which is that you should only study behavioral science and behavioral economics in parallel with a little bit of study of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory. And the reason I believe this is vital is because you will hear words like heuristics and biases bandied around fairly frequently. And because the word bias has a pejorative connotation, it's very easy to accept the economist's view that every time that human behavior differs from that believed to be optimal in the standard economic model, therefore humans are actually adopting some sort of suboptimal behavior. Now, let me just explain what I mean here. If you look at the assumptions that are made in order to make economic theory mathematically tractable and neat, almost all of them are not only comfortable, lazy assumptions, they're actually fundamentally wrong. It reminds me a little bit of an old joke, which is that I think it's a physicist, a biologist, and a mathematician have their budgets cut for their faculties that year, and they say, well, this shouldn't be a problem. We're absolutely fantastic scientists. If we can just crack horse racing, then we can just place an enormous bet with our combined budget, triple our money, and we'll be even better funded than we were last time. And they come back 3 months later, and the biologist is asked, what progress have you made? And you go, well, not that much. And I can tell that heredity is pretty important in horse racing, but I really got nowhere. And the mathematician comes back and goes, well, statistically speaking, there doesn't seem to be any way of actually beating the market here. And the physicist walks up and goes, no, we've solved it. Absolutely perfect. No problem at all. Cracked horse racing completely. The other two look at them and go, how on earth do you manage to do this? Well, first we assume that the horse is a perfect sphere and that the race takes place in a vacuum. Okay. Now, the point about those two assumptions is there are assumptions which are kind of fine because they're reasonable assumptions. There are assumptions which are actually totally wrong. And the assumptions that economics makes is that we are all individual utility maximizing actors seeking to maximize our expected utility in a series of standalone transactions in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. Okay? Now, those aren't really just assumptions. They're actually distortions, I would argue. And for two reasons. One, even today, okay, those conditions of perfect information and perfect trust exist in reality somewhere between very rarely and never, and it's much closer to never. We never know everything there is to know. There's a huge degree of future uncertainty every time we make a decision. Every time we make a decision, there's some sort of statistical question at stake of assuming this, assuming that. And there's never complete trust. And even if you could create those conditions, which I rather doubt, but even if you could create them, it doesn't really matter anyway because our brains haven't evolved to operate under such conditions. What our brains have evolved to do is to make pretty good, non-catastrophic decisions based on imperfect information in a world where you can't trust people. Now, anybody who wasn't pretty good at doing that wouldn't have left many descendants. So we are uniquely descended from people who are reasonably good at solving those problems. Imperfect, asymmetric information, imperfect trust, making decisions which at the very least were non-fatal and non-disastrous, and were, on balance, pretty good. There's no such thing as an optimal decision. Most real-world decisions, there's no mathematical formula for choosing a wife, buying a house. None of those big decisions you make can actually be reduced to any kind of mathematical perfection whereby you can optimize the solution. So what Herbert Simon calls satisficing is the best we can do. And what's really important about that is that quite a lot of what we've evolved to do and quite a lot of what the instinctive brain seems to be good at is latching onto heuristics that are, if not perfect, given the information that is likely to be available, are pretty much as good as you can get. So, let's take the example which is always given by Gerd Gigerenzer and others over a pretty damn good heuristic, which is how someone catches a high-flying ball. I'm recording this at the same time as the World Series, so it's a particularly appropriate time to talk about this. Now, if you look at someone catching a ball, you will see they don't move in a perfect straight line towards the point where the ball will land and catch it. They move in a slight curve. There is a slight price they pay. Okay. Now, the reason that happens is because in order to perfectly solve that problem, you would need to know air resistance, wind direction. You need to know the velocity and angle at which the ball left the bat. Now, those bits of information are not available to you, okay? Actually, nobody knows the velocity at which the ball left the bat. The batsman might know better than you do, but since he doesn't want you to catch the ball, he's going to lie to you. So the last thing you can do, even if the batsman knew perfectly the angle and velocity at which the ball left the bat, you can't trust him. Okay, so you've got imperfect trust and you've got imperfect information. What we've evolved to do is we look at the angle of gaze, we look up at the ball, see the angle at which we're looking at it, and move towards the ball at whatever speed and direction keeps that angle constant. So we're not solving a quadratic equation there and correcting for wind resistance. What we're doing is we've found, brilliantly, I would argue, a thing where even where the batsman's going to lie to you and where you don't know anything at all, you can do a pretty good job of catching that ball. Dogs do it with frisbees, humans do it with baseballs and with cricket balls. It's a great heuristic. To call it a bias is a nonsense. And I think we've got to be really careful about this, because a large part of where I sometimes disagree with people who criticize human behavior as being irrational, which is a word I'm very, very uncomfortable using, is because what we're essentially doing is saying, well, in a perfect world, they wouldn't do this. But since there isn't a perfect world and we didn't evolve for one, calling something stupid, which is actually incredibly clever, is a very, very dangerous misuse of language. Now, another great heuristic, which I always share, you all know Sully Sullenberger landing the plane in the Hudson. Now, the interesting thing about that was that if you listen to the radio recording, which we could play, actually, because it's available on YouTube, what you'll hear is that both engines are knocked out by a bird strike. He's very rapidly looking for places to land. He realizes, I think correctly, that it's pretty much, by the time he's worked out there's a bird strike, it's too late to make it back to LaGuardia, where they took off. So his next request is, he gets onto air traffic control and says, can you prepare for an emergency landing at Teterboro, which is over in New Jersey, somewhere over to the starboard side. And then busily, the dispatcher gets on with actually clearing for an emergency landing at Teterboro, but about 5 seconds later, Sullenberger says, we're not going to make it, you'll find us in the Hudson. And then he goes quiet, concentrating on the more important business of landing in a river. Now, a few interesting things. Sullenberger is himself a glider pilot. That's his hobby in his spare time. All glider pilots know, and I think most pilots know, a fairly reliable heuristic for can I make it or not, which is you put the plane, how does he answer that question so quickly? I'm not going to make it. Okay? And the answer is that he knows a heuristic way that you can solve that problem without resorting to complicated mathematical equations where one decimal point out of place would lead to total disaster. And it's you put the plane into as shallow a glide as is possible and you look forward out of the window. Those places in your field of view which are moving upwards are places which you can't land in, and those places which are moving downwards are places where you can land. He saw that effectively Teterboro was the wrong side of that line, he wasn't going to make it, and so within 5 seconds, quickly and frugally, he worked out not necessarily the right thing to do, but the best non-catastrophic thing to do. There's no right thing to do under those circumstances, you might argue. And so, in the animal kingdom, quite a lot of evolutionary success is predicated on understanding these heuristics. We don't know whether they're learned or whether they're instinctive always, although in some animal cases, the ants that work out the surface area of a crevice, for example, it patently is instinctive. One virtue, by the way, of a heuristic over using mathematical reasoning is that heuristics are probably heritable, whereas maths has to be taught. And so in terms of the reliability of survival, a good reproducible heuristic is a hell of a lot more valuable than something that needs to be taught.